So we're just going to start with a 15-minute opening statements, 10-minute rebuttals, then a 5-minute rebuttal round, 15-minute for cross-examination Q&A, and then a 5-minute closing statement. So whenever you're ready, Ahmadi Muslim 1889, your time starts whenever you start speaking.
All right. So my nickname is Ahmadi Muslim 1889. I am 19 years old and I converted on November 15th, 2016. Before, I was an atheist who tended to shift between Christianity and atheism over the years. And everything that I am doing today is independent of my community, as I've come to debate Christian anarchists on my own. So if I say something contrary to the views of the scholars of Ahmadiyya, you will know that I have come here on my own. So, according to the ref to the document that our opponent shared, um, our opponent shared an incorrect interpretation of Quran, uh, chapter 5, verse 47, where he stated that in his notes that basically the people of the Gospels, what the people of the Gospel decide which revelation is the correct one. But the correct context is that the Quran tells Christians to judge from the prophecies of the advent of Muhammad in the Gospels, or what he's called the Paraclete. So you have stated that Ibn Abbas said that the word of Allah cannot be changed. While that is true, our opponent misses the rest of the commentary made by Ibn Kathir. The commentator further added, Wahb bin Manabil said that Torah and the Injil remain as Allah revealed them, and no letter in them was revealed. However, people misguide others by addition and false interpretation, relying on books that they wrote themselves. Then they say this is from Allah, but it is not from Allah. As for Allah's books, they are still preserved and cannot be changed. Ibn Abi Hatim recorded this statement. However, if Wahab meant the books that are currently in the hands of the people of the book, then we should state that there is no doubt that they altered, distorted, added to, and deleted from them. For instance, the Arabic versions of these books contains tremendous error, many additions and deletions, and enormous misinterpretations. Those who rendered these translations have incorrect comprehension at most, rather out of these translations. If Walab meant the books of Allah that he has with him, then indeed these books are preserved and were never changed. So, from what we understand, is that Ibn Kathir was pretty clear that he was speaking of the revelations of the Torah and the Gospel themselves, not being changed or altered rather than the books in their written form. Our opponent has mentioned a prophecy in his notes about uh, a prophecy that Mirza Gulam Ahmad made in September. So, why Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was a prophet? In our view, he was a prophet because it is simple. A prophet is one who receives revelation from God, and he is bestowed the title of a prophet. Through the seal of Muhammad, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, as a result, is a Nabi. Now, this type of prophethood is something that we've never seen in previous prophets before. Because of the seal of Muhammad, which is the final prophethood, in this age. Therefore, forms of independent prophethood are no longer here. Now, when prophets come, they must bear the seal of Muhammad. Further, when Mirza Ghulam Ahmad made his claim in 1891, he declared himself the Messiah, son of Mary. Now, why was he bestowed this title? It was because he had the qualities of Jesus. He had a similar character as Jesus. He spoke like Jesus. His goal was to preach peace to his people. And whenever he challenged his opponents to prayer duels, and they did it, for example, the prayer duel between him and the so-called Christian prophet Alexander Graham of Zion in the early 1900s, Alexander ended up dying and humiliated by his opponents because he was speaking falsely against Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. Further, there are several times where Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was on the verge of death, for he was a man that did not have very good health. And there were times that he got so sick that he thought that his end was near. But when Allah gave him revelations that he would feel better and that he would be delivered, these prophecies ended up true and coming to pass. And soon he was restored to good health. So, as we see here, this is a test against his opponents to see that if he dies or not, but his time has not come. And then there's another revelation where during the early 1900s, I believe, one of his sons was very sick, and he too was on the verge of death. He received the promised Messiah, received a revelation concerning that his son's demise was near. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad did not want this to happen, so he immediately prayed to God to deliver his son from the sickness. And he placed his hands on his son as his son fell out of consciousness, and he brought him back to consciousness. So, according to his interpretation, this is what the raising of the dead in the Gospels really meant, as we see a modern example of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad curing a sick person through the grace of and mercy of God Almighty. Another thing is of him prophesizing the doom of Abdullah Atham in 1894, where Abdullah Atham the year before, and even then the year after, he was making false statements against Muhammad. And he was abusing and reviling him, calling him a Dajjal, an Antichrist. So, as a result, they both engaged in a prayer duel to see which one would get death. And on June 5th, 1893, going back to 1893, here in the Tazirka on page 303, we get the reference. What was disclosed to me last night is that when I supplicated the divine with great humility and earnestness, may you decide this matter between us. We are your humble servants. We cannot accomplish anything except through your will. He gave me this sign as a glad tidings that Whichever of the two parties in this debate is deliberately adopting a false stand and deserting the true God and is defying a humble man will severely be afflicted within a period of months corresponding to the number of days of this debate. That is to say, within 15 months, he will be greatly humiliated, provided he does not turn to the truth. And he who stand is on the truth, and who believes in the true God will be thereby exalted. When the prophecy is fulfilled, some who are blind will begin to see, some who are lame will begin to walk, and some who are deaf will begin to hear. Now, personally, I do not believe that these are literal, but rather these are metaphorical, as we see from the Dream Dictionary of My Islamic Dream, which has dream interpretations from the famous dream interpreter Ibn Sirin and most Islamic scholars. So, number one, blindness. What does blindness mean in a dream? In a dream, blindness means heedlessness, misguidance, or receiving an inheritance. Further, being blind, and healed by a person, that person will lead the dreamer to the right path, help him repent, and serve his interest. So, from what we understand from this interpretation, is that if the Christians see that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is in the correct, they will be guided. This includes Abdullah Atham himself. Now, the second interpretation, would, or excuse me, the second thing in a dream, physical paralysis. Paralysis in a dream means corruption in one's religious life, or introducing innovations to one's religion and suffering the consequences of playing with Allah's words. The dream interpreter is Ibn Sirin, and then the last thing, deafness. Dreaming of being deaf means corrupt religious faith. So, from what we understand of these dream symbols that I shared with you guys, um, what's Mirza Ghulam Ahmad meant by the blind being be able to see, some who are lame will begin to walk, and some who are deaf will begin to hear. Basically, the Christians would join Ahmadiyya, and that they would see for themselves that uh, the truthfulness of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And I believe my time is up, so whenever you're ready, Christian anarchist, you could start.
All right. You had 2 minutes left, but all right.
Oh, I was a little off.
All right. So I was actually about to send a 1 minute warning. If you can, mute your mic until it's your turn next, so that way we don't get it.
That way my coughs don't get in the way and the fan in the background.
All right. All right. So we'll start. And all right. Well, I want to thank Ahmadi Muslim 1889 for participating in this debate. The reason why we're doing this without a moderator is because I believe we're both well respectable towards each other, that we're not going to interrupt or cut off each other when we're doing our thing here. So that being said, the thesis for the debate is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad a prophet? I'm not going to be responding to any of the things that he has said. I will do that in the rebuttal rounds, which will come after our opening statements, for me to address some of the points that has been made. So the first thing I want to go over are the following. So we know this, that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad has claimed that at one point that he's a prophet, though it's interesting in the way that he puts it in the book known as Hakikat ul-Wahi Zamima. In pages 64 to 65, he says, I have been named by Allah as Nabi, as prophet, by way of metaphor, not by way of reality, Hakikat. So whatever you take it as, whether he's an actual Nabi or he is a metaphorical form of a Nabi or a prophet, he is still a prophet regardless of what the usage is. And according to the Quran itself, and Surah 3, Ayah 3 through 4, and then of course it says, go to the Gospels and even the Torah to confirm the message that Muhammad had preached. And even the scholars will affirm this matter. But of course, as he mentioned, that there's probably some Arabic that was different. But the matter of the fact is that going to the Greek and the Hebrew manuscripts show that there has no been corruption concerning the one verse that's important, that is Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 22, which says, when a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, the thing follows not, nor comes to pass. That is the thing which the Lord has not spoken, but the prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Thou shalt not be afraid of him. In fact, it even goes further to say that if he is a false prophet that speaks something false in the name, he should be put to death by the standard of the Torah. But of course, we're just simply going by that we should not fear or even assume that it's a prophet. So let's hold this Mirza Gulam Ahmad to the test and examine some things that he has said. Now, again, this would probably be the only thing that will be connected to what my opponent said in his opening statements. The Abdullah Athim issue. It was more than just simply a prayer battle. What it was is that for 15 months they or for a few months actually, they were exchanging letters in a letter debate. It wasn't a speaking debate, but rather they would exchange letters to each other to debate the matter of who was true in the regards. And at the end of the debate, as what we have noted in what's one of the books that I'll be quoting from the most is a book called Ruhani Khazin, which is in English, Spiritual Treasures. So in volume 9 of this book, we hear that as a result of the debate and its conclusions, some of the Ahmadiyans at that point ended up converting to Christianity. And because of this, as we read in volume 6 of Ruhani Khazini, it says that when I humbly entreated and implored God Almighty and prayed to him to show me the details of the matter, he indicated to me that the liar, referring to Abdullah Athim, will die within 15 months. And at this point, this is referring to that he would die before September 5th, 1894, provided he does not return to the truth, meaning provided he does not convert back, or he does not come back to Islam or something like that. And then mentions that when the prophecy is fulfilled, then blind man will see paralyzed start walking and the deaf start hearing. And then he says that if the prophecy is proven to be false, I am prepared for every punishment. What's interesting to note about why that happened is also the fact that there was a blind man, a paralyzed man, and a deaf man who, towards the conclusion of the debate, went to Mirza Gulam Ahmad saying, hey, please heal us like Jesus had healed people in the past. And Mirza Gulam Ahmad refused. This is noted again in volume 9 of the letter. Now, in volume 13, we read something that is shockingly omitted. Though I don't have the translation, you can look it up on page 163. That's in the Arabic and the Urdu version of Spiritual Treasures. It's free online to access. That the followers of Ahmad attempted to take Abdullah Athim's life within the time of the prophecy so that it could come true. So that's why Abdullah Athim then had to also start getting security as well to help defend him from the assassination attacks, which included some people planting snakes in his room and all that. So with every new revelation then that started coming in later, that was supposed to narrow it down specifically that day, but something different would happen, it kept failing, and Abdullah Athim kept surviving, and Ahmad was proven false. But in the second page of the 9th volume of Spiritual Treasures, he claims that, well, since he hasn't passed away or died yet, that must mean one thing. Remember that he said, provided he has not returned to the truth. So must assume that Abdullah Athim converted back or converted to Islam. But there are two sources that debunk this. One that's questionable to some people, but then another that's something that you can rely on. In September 15th, 1894, in Lahore, we read this following from a newspaper article. I invite your attention to the prophecy of Gulam Ahmad about my death. I inform you that by the grace of God, I am safe and sound. I have heard Gulam Ahmad alleging that I have turned my back on Christianity. I proclaim that this is a lie. I was a Christian, and I ever remained a Christian, and I thank God that he made me a Christian. And then, of course, you have from the son-in-law of Gulam Ahmad himself, Muhammad Ali Khan, in a letter to Ahmad entitled Aina-i-Haq Numa. It says, today is the 7th of September, while the last day of the fulfillment of the grand prophecy was the 5th of September. I shall not repeat the words of the prophecy. I shall, however, mention the words of your revelation. And after repeating what was just revealed earlier in the beginning of this opening statement, he says, was this prophecy fulfilled according to Mirza Sahib's description? No, never. Abdullah Athim is safe, sound, and alive, and is not punished by dead to be flung into hell. I do not consider any other interpretation is possible for this prophecy than that it was clearly meant to be. It, however, sounds very ugly that every prophecy is misunderstood and had to be elaborately interpreted to be rightly understood. But then it goes on to say, quote, as for the prophecy concerning Atham, it has given birth to the very masterpiece of distortion and interpretation, meaning that according to the son-in-law of Gulam Ahmad himself, that there have been so many people that had to just distort and interpret what Gulam Ahmad meant just so that they could protect the value of the prophet, of this supposed prophet, in what he had said. And this is coming from one of the followers of him, as well as his son-in-law as well. So that being said, there's another false prophecy. In volume 19, and I believe it's also somewhere in the Tariqi as well, that he says, God has, however, given me the good news that I shall live for 80 years or more. So he says that, okay, I'm going to live for 80 years or more, and this has been the good news that's been revealed to me from God. How long did it take? How old was Mirza Gulam Ahmad when he passed away? He was 73 years old. He did not live to be at least 80 or more years old. He died at the age of 73 when he said that God's revealed the good news that he should live for 80 years or more. So the very fact that he died at the age of 73 proves that that either he made this up or that God is false. Either way, it doesn't sound like a good case for people trying to assert he's a prophet. And by Deuteronomy 18:22 from the Torah, that should debunk already what he's saying. Another thing is also the fact that with Jesus in Islamic thought is being viewed as the Messiah and as a good prophet of God, you would assume that there's some things that is nicely appreciated about him. But according to Mirza Gulam Ahmad in volume 11 of Spiritual Treasures, page 291, he basically says that Jesus' miracles can be explained because there was some pond nearby that was the source of the miracles, and even saying that, quote, he had nothing to his credit except cunning and deceit. Jesus' 3 paternal and maternal grandmothers were fornicators and prostitutes from whose blood Jesus came into existence. Then in volume 9, page 449, he talks about Jesus' encounter with a prostitute, and it said that whenever she sat on his lap, said, quote, in that condition, the Messiah is sitting in ecstasy. If someone rises to object, he is scolded. In addition to his youth, dependency on alcoholic beverages, being a bachelor, a beautiful prostitute is lying in front of him, touching her body against his. So he's basically saying that not only was he a horny man, but he was also a drunkard, depending on alcoholic beverages. Then in volume 11, page 290, he says, a most shameful thing is that the Sermon on the Mount, which is the essence of the Bible, is Jesus plagiarized from the Talmud and pretended it to be his own preaching. Since this fraud has been exposed, Christians are very embarrassed. Jesus did this to perhaps gain influence by presenting some good teachings. So for one, he says that it's been plagiarized from the Talmud, even though the Talmud was not written during the time of Jesus Christ. In fact, the Talmud mentions Jesus and his crucifixion later. So how could he plagiarize from the Talmud if it hasn't even been written down yet in existence? And to say that even the Sermon on the Mount, which is from the Gospels, from the Injil, that it's a shameful thing and that it's the essence of the Bible. I mean, why are you then going to assume that Jesus himself, one of the prophets of Islam, is a plagiarizer and has done a shameful thing? Not only that, volume 18, he even denies that Jesus could return by saying that people are claiming that Jesus is sitting in the heavens. How great an injustice is this? God, in keeping his promise, has power over everything, but he can never send a person to this world the second time whose first coming has caused so much harm. So it's denying Jesus' return. And at one point, though he claims it's metaphorical, claimed to be for 2 years nurtured as Mary and was raised in a womanly seclusion. Though he claimed it was metaphorical, then says that after a period of several months, not exceeding 10, he was made Jesus out of Mary. And then he insults Jesus in volume 9, page 387 by saying, "What was the character of Messiah according to you? An alcoholic and gluttonous person, neither abstinent nor a pious worshiper, nor an adorer of truth. He was an arrogant and self-conceited claimant of divinity." So he even right there affirms that Jesus' divinity, that Jesus claimed divinity, which of course that is definitely in the Gospels. And then, of course, one more thing to note is in page 22 to 23 of Jesus in India, a book that Ahmad wrote. He says the Gospel of Barnabas, quote, which should be available in the London Library, it is written that he was not put on the cross, nor did he die thereupon. We could very well point out that though this book is not included in the Gospels and has been rejected summarily, but there is no doubt that it is an ancient book and was written at the same time as the other Gospels. Now, the problem with this is the fact that it is actually not the dated in the original Gospels. And if Allah was supposedly revealing these things to him, he would know that because it's a 16th century document, a 16th century forgery. And as scholar Cyril Glass tells us in page 78 of the New Encyclopedia of Islam, the following, quote, "As regards to the Gospel of Barnabas itself, there is no question that it is a medieval forgery. A complete Italian manuscript exists, which appears to be a translation from a Spanish original, which exists in part, written to curry favor with Muslims of the time. It contains anachronisms which can date only from the Middle Ages and not before, and shows a garbled comprehension of Islamic doctrines, calling the Prophet Muhammad the Messiah, which Islam does not claim for him." And I will assure you that definitely my opponent here would not believe that Muhammad was the Messiah, but that it was Jesus or Isa ibn Maryam. And an example where you see that it has to be a 16th century document is the language that it utilizes that would have been foreign to a person in the first century. And that is in chapter 38 of the Gospel. It talks about the year of Jubilee being celebrated every 100 years. But according to the traditions that we have, it was celebrated every 50 years until 1343 AD, when the Pope at that time declared and decreed that Jubilee now is celebrated every 100 years. So with a minute left, I just want to point out that these things alone, these facts that we have demonstrated, should show that what we see from Mirza Gulam Ahmad is a very bad misunderstanding of history, trying to claim something is ancient when it's not, having two false prophecies that he has made about himself, attacking the Messiah figure in both Christian thought and Islamic thought, biblical and Quranic. And these alone should demonstrate to us one thing, that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, though he claimed to be one, by certainty he was not a prophet of God. And with that, I end my time. So that being said, we are going to then take it to the 10-minute rebuttal round. So whenever you wish to go ahead, you may start, and I will start the timer whenever you start speaking.
We would like to thank our opponents for sharing their time on offering their concerns against Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. For each point, we will address everything that our opponent said. So, and some of the stuff I've already, not knowing the timing, I already rebutted in the thing, but nevertheless, I will repeat it just for what this conversation was intended to be. So, our opponent shared a reference regarding the Quran chapter 5 verse 47. The correct context is that the Quran tells Christians to judge from the prophecies of the advent of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the Paraclete in the Gospels. So, what we can see here is that it's not to compare the Gospels or the Quran to see if they're both like exactly the same. No, that's a complete misunderstanding that Christians tend to have. So I shared the correct interpretation is of the prophecies of the advent of Muhammad. Now, our opponent shared something from Ibn Kathir in his commentary on Surah 3, verse 78. While it is true that Ibn Abbas said the words of Allah cannot be changed in the Torah and the Gospels, our opponent misses the rest of the commentary made by Ibn Kathir. After he shared that reference by Ibn Abbas of the Torah and the Gospel not being changed, he adds a narration from Wahab bin Manabid. So he said, the Torah and the Injil remain as Allah revealed them, and no letter in them was removed. However, the people misguide others by addition and false interpretation, relying on books that they wrote themselves, and adding on his commentary on which is Ibn Kathir, they say this is from Allah, but it is not from Allah. And he adds, as for Allah's books, they are still preserved and cannot be changed. Ibn Abi Hatim recorded this statement. However, if Waib meant the books that are currently in the hands of the people of the book, which is the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that then we should state that there is no doubt that they altered, distorted, added to, and deleted from them. And to add to that, there was indeed some additions in the Gospels, as we see in the longer ending of Mark and John chapter 7, verse 53 through chapter 8, verse 11. Those are two examples of some additions. Now, continuing on my commentary there, the narrator said, for instance, the Arabic versions of these books contains tremendous error, many additions and deletions, and enormous misinterpretation. Again, according to the footnotes of the Bibles I have, there have been additions and deletions. I'm pretty sure most of them have been unintentional, as we see from the manuscript evidence. 'Cause over the period of thousands of years, many dedicated Christians wrote these manuscripts because of the fact that there was no printing press at the time. So you are going to expect that they're going to accidentally omit some verses or maybe affirm to the wrong tradition and add some verses in. Now, continuing on, he further states those who rendered these translations have incorrect comprehension in most, rather all of these translations. If Wahab meant the books of Allah that he has with him, then indeed these books are preserved and were never changed. So, from what we see from Ibn Kathir, the commentator was pretty clear that he was speaking of the revelations of the Torah and the Gospels themselves, not being changed and altered. Rather, he was referring to the books in their current written form. So, so the misunderstanding that our opponent has about the Torah and the Gospel is that he's confusing the revelations themselves with the written accounts of what happened. Because when the Quran speaks of the Gospel, it only speaks of the revelation itself, not the four written accounts that we have today. Now, now in reply to his allegation against Mirza Ghulam Ahmad and Abdullah al-Watham, this is what we offer. We are positive that the blind, paralyzed, and deaf parts, which is his prophecy about Abdullah Atham's death on September 5th, is that we don't see these as literal, and I already provided these earlier in the conversation. And because I'm running out of time, I'm gonna move on since I already mentioned that stuff. So, what Christian anarchists said, although Ahmed also asked the Christians to heal the blind, deaf, and paralyzed, is that since he didn't heal them, according to the books that he offered, therefore the Christians said this is why he's supposedly a false prophet. However, what our opponent did not mention is that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad also told them that maybe you should heal these men. If you are so faithful in your Jesus, why don't you heal these men yourselves? And then as for the Ahmadis leaving the faith for Christianity, this was part of a divine plan according to an earlier revelation. It was necessary to see those who would remain loyal to Ahmed. What is supposedly in volume 13 that our opponent referenced is out of character for Mirza Ghulam Ahmad and his followers. And this is in reference to the followers of Ahmadiyya trying to plot against Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. Now, this, in a way, is out of character because our founders said in the introduction of Jesus in India, the Messiah that is to come will not bring bloodshed to this earth, but to restore peace. If what our opponent alleges to be true, he must explain why Mirza Ghulam Ahmad preached something contrary to his claim, which is him sending his people to kill Abdullah Atham. Now, regarding our opponents saying that Abdullah Atham would convert to Islam in his delayed doom, this is not necessarily true. Atham began acknowledging the greatness of Islam, thus delaying his prophesied doom, which is in Tazirka 327, 328. And I'll read the passage. The date is 1894. Divine revelation apprised me that Deputy Abdullah Atham partook to some degree of turning to the truth of his acknowledgement of the greatness of Islam and recognizing its prestige. This delayed his prophesied death and being afflicted to the utmost degree. He was in a manner afflicted, but for his greater affliction, which is called death, was delayed for a short while. God Almighty revealed to me, Allah has taken note of his grief and sorrow. Allah has given him respite until the time he reverts to his impertinence, harsh language, and falsehood, and forgets the favor. Further, in addition to this, here is a note by Maulana Jalal-ud-Din Shams. Malik Salah-ud-Din narrates from Manishu Muhammad Ishmael Sailukadi that when it was the last day of the time appointed for Atham's chastisement, the Prophet came to the upper floor of the Masjid Mubarak and called for Malavi Abdullah Kahim and said, I have received a revelation. Allah has taken note of his grief and sorrow. I have been given to understand that his refers to Atham, and this shows that he would not die within the announced period. So this was on the last day of his prophesied doom. So what our opponents shared a couple from another companion of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad a couple days later, he misses that on the last day, Manishi Muhammad Ishmael Sayuki said that the promise of Messiah came to him. And I believe my time is up. So
All right.
whenever you're ready.
All right. Let me just set the timer up again. All right. So a few things to respond to what has been mentioned. So there's been a mix-up with the issue about what has been mentioned in Surah 5 and Surah 3, especially concerning what I said about Abdullah ibn Abbas and what he said, but then said I needed to continue reading to what Ibn Kathir said later on. The reason why I narrowly said and focused on Abdullah ibn Abbas is that according to the Sunnah, according to the Hadith, Muhammad prayed to Allah to grant Ibn Abbas great wisdom and the knowledge of the Quran. And because of that, definitely all the scholars are in agreement that Abdullah ibn Abbas is the greatest commentator of the Quran, because he was given the divine wisdom and knowledge of interpreting the Quran, which is why in the Islamic Ummah at that time, the Ummah went to him for advice on the Quran interpretation, as well as Muhammad. But of course, even after Muhammad's death, then it's Ibn Abbas that then gets the same the treatment, because he's been given that knowledge. So that's why I focus on him. Now, I agree that Ibn Kathir is a great scholar, but at the same time, remember what Ibn Abbas said, because he was a contemporary of Muhammad when this is being revealed. And I'm sure even Ibn Kathir himself would agree that Ibn Abbas would have an authority over this. Ibn Kathir, whenever he makes a commentary, mostly he is bringing out hadith and how other people are going about either a story that's how this should be interpreted, as well as what other things are going about. That's why one of the reasons why as well as Al-Tabari is considered one of the great tafsirs, is because not just giving their own opinion, but they're going back to the Salafs, they're going back to the contemporaries of Muhammad and the hadith that could be mentioned. Because as even the one that I mentioned, the Abdullah ibn Abbas, when he makes the specific commentary that's in Ibn Kathir's statement or tafsir. And by the way, this is Surah 3, Ayah 78. That's the case. It says that this was translated by Bukhari. So I'm just going by what the standard is there. Okay, so next thing to focus on is the manuscripts. So he says that, well, that is not referring to, the Gospels had been corrupted, and maybe as well as the Torah. Okay, fine. We agree that, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, not in the original text. But let's find out what is. And if you go looking at the manuscripts, Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 22 reads the way that it is in all the manuscripts that we have, especially the earliest. In fact, I'll give you the earliest, the Qumran scroll 4Q33. And it has Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 22, which says, in the translation that they have with that Hebrew, when a prophet speaks in Yahweh's name, if the thing does not follow nor happen, that is the thing which Yahweh has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You should not be afraid of him. The one thing that the website here mentions is that the only words that are in the deal are these two words that are in blue, happen and the thing. And according to that, that just means maybe a letter is missing, or that the word can sometimes be unreadable, but we have enough manuscripts to figure out and piece together what it actually is saying. So we are able to see, even though this is an old manuscript, and by the way, dates back from the 50 BC, almost near that time. So it's an old manuscript, and we show that contains what I just read to you. And I think that truth still stands because it is from the Torah. Deuteronomy is from the Torah. Now, concerning the Gospels, he said that, well, he's not referring to the original. He's not referring to the four Gospels. He's referring to the gospel message itself that was with Jesus. Well, we can trust that it's from that because oral transmission was very reliable at that time. In fact, that was the main essence of education at that time, especially if you were a rabbi. We see this in Plutarch's Education, chapter 13. Among other different works of antiquity that focus on how at the time of Jesus that remembering things was key for oral transmission. And so we realized that especially for those who had to be a rabbi, you had to gain this knowledge and have to relay that. So Jesus, as well as the apostles, would have that knowledge regardless of their profession at that time period. Education was still that important, and especially considering we had Matthew, who was a tax collector, had to remember that stuff, the money that he was offering and collecting for the Roman Empire. Luke was a physician, so he of course had education to remember all these things that were then being recorded from other people at the time, that other people had the memory transmission. Mark got his message from Peter, so he was getting the eyewitness account, is able to memorize and keep this going until his lifetime passed away. And then we can see the same thing, that John's just going off the same pattern with these people. Now, concerning why I also would assert that the Old Testament would then be reliable in the same case that Jewish scribes were, though I won't have time to go over them, they were very well articulate in their case to make sure that it was the same way as it was in the New Testament time. Now, my opponent says that according to the Abdullah Athim passage, which, by the way, I still want to get my opponent's response within the next 5-minute rebuttal, what his response is to the issue about the age in which Mirza Gulam Ahmad would die, which said that he would die at least at the age of 80, but he died at the age of 73. Now, concerning the issue here about, well, he didn't send them because that would contradict his message. Well, I didn't say he sent them. I just said that they went after him and that attempts on his life were made. But because there are passages where it says that the followers were making bets and trying to make a bet as to what exactly would be the day that he would die, and that their faces were pale because the time was getting near. That if it was the case, then it would expose Mirza Ghulam Ahmad to make a false prophecy. But even if let's say, regardless of it, why would this happen? Why would he do that if it would be hypocritical to his message? I think that's the point, that he is a hypocrite. And that's another reason why he's a false prophet who would contradict himself. Like I said, he would put Jesus in a high regard in one book, like in Jesus in India, if you've read that. But then if you look at some of the statements in Ruhani Kazani, he is trash talking Jesus. He's basically said that his bloodline comes from a bunch of prostitutes, which there's nowhere in any text that demonstrates that the bloodline is these paternal grandmothers that were whores, as he said. There's nowhere to suggest that Jesus was an adulteress, nowhere to suggest that Jesus was a drunkard. Again, these are just attacks, even saying that Jesus used cunning deceit, that Jesus plagiarized from the Talmud, which, by the way, the Talmud wasn't around during the time of Jesus because the Talmud mentions Jesus and his crucifixion. So how can he plagiarize that when, again, there's no evidence that suggests that it was written during the time of Christ? And even then, he makes all these claims about Jesus, even saying that Jesus was an arrogant and self-conceited claimant of divinity. But my opponent here would deny that Jesus was God. But yet, it seems Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in volume 9, page 387 of his book of Spiritual Treasures, he seems to suggest that's the case. That, well, Jesus was a self-conceited claimant of divinity. So, I mean, which case is it? It sounds like contradictory if you're going to say that he's a follower of Islam and the Quran denies Jesus being God, but yet at the same time, here you have him, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, saying that, well, he is a self-conceited claimant of divinity. So which is it? Focus on who the biblical, or not the biblical, your version of Jesus. If you're going to say that there's a Jesus, then talk about that Jesus. But instead, he talks about Jesus as a general rule of thumb, which must include his beliefs on what Jesus is. So again, to me, that's demonstrably a proof and evidence of him being a false prophet. So again, with the minute left, I will just bring one thing that I would like to hear, hopefully in the 5-minute rebuttal. And if they're not mentioned, I'll just bring it up in the cross-examination that we'll have. How do you explain the fact that he failed to predict the death that he would have, since he said he would die at least at the age of 80 when he died at 73? How do you wrestle with these statements he has made about Jesus? And then how do you deal with the Gospel of Barnabas that was mentioned in pages 22 to 23, at least in the online copy of Jesus in India that is provided by alislam.com or .org, however you pronounce it, in which he claims it's an ancient document? How can a man like this do that, as well as affirm the Gospel of Barnabas as supposedly something that's to be respected, even though it says Muhammad is the Messiah versus the Quran saying Jesus is the Messiah? And with that, I end my time. All right. So you will have now, we have one more rebuttal round, which will be 5 minutes. So whenever you're ready, Ahmadi Muslim, whenever you start, I'll start the timer.
I will start now. Now, I agree with my opponent that everything was oral and everybody remembered it. Kind of the Jews at the time, it was a tradition to do things orally. Similarly, that's how the Arabs did it when they transmitted the Quran. And similarly, remembering things was key. So, but my point is that because the Gospels aren't the revelation of Jesus himself, I lost my train of thoughts. Oh, right. Because they weren't the revelation of Jesus himself. He didn't write down the Gospels himself. So, because we get these things from uh various sources, as Luke says in his chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. Now, um, as for Christian anarchists saying the Ahmadis made bets, I'm not sure what the context is at, because I'm pretty sure making bets is not Islamic. Um, maybe I'll learn the context of why they did so. Now, as for my opponent saying that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was a hypocrite, I defer with that, as he was pretty serious about what he said in his things. Um, when he was praying for the death of Abdullah Atham, he was divinely authorized to do so. And when his followers were praying for his death, this was at the request of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, as divine, as being divinely authorized. They weren't doing it of their own desires, but they were doing it on the basis of divine revelation. Now, Christian anarchists said that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad suggested that Jesus is God according to the Gospels. Yes, that could be true because of John chapter 1, verse 1, but Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was not saying that Jesus is God. He was just speaking out against what the Bible thought of Jesus. Now, as for him saying, as for him talking about his age, we must remember that 73 years is his age on the Gregorian calendar, and from what we commonly know. However, if we look at the Islamic calendar, he died at age 75 to 76. Further, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad received the revelation of him living to 80 or more or less several times, as far back as 1865. On the Tadhirka, page 9, he got the revelation. Your age will be 80 years. A few less or some more, and you will live long enough to witness your distant progenies. So, from what we understand, is that at in 1908 he lived to see his progeny, such as his son, which is the second Khalifa. Now, due to the shortage of time, I'm going to jump to the Gospel of Barnabas. Now, even if the Gospel of Barnabas is a forgery, and yes, I admit there are some questionable things, such as Jesus being raised to heaven and not being put on the cross, and Muhammad, being the Messiah rather than Jesus. Now to get to the point, even if Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was wrong about this does not disprove his prophethood, because people have a tendency to confuse like someone's knowledge with revelation. It has nothing to do with his revelation, and plus, in Jesus of India, he never mentions that he received the Gospel of Barnabas in a revelation. He was just going by traditions, and with that, I end my case.
All right. I'll go ahead and start mine then in 5 minutes. Okay, so several points. First of all, okay, so I agree. It's not supposed to be about a revelation concerning what is said by him about the Gospel of Barnabas. It's not that, but the fact that he endorsed such a book. He said that it is an ancient book and was written at the same time as the other Gospels. He then goes on to say, can't we therefore view this book as an ancient chronicle and make use of it as an historical document? Can't we conclude from this book that at the time when the events of the cross took place, people were not ununanimous as to Jesus having died on the cross? Which, if you think about that as well, for those who aren't familiar with Mirza Gulam Ahmad's theology, he held to the idea of swoon theory, that Jesus was on the cross, but that he swooned, that he fainted. But the issue is that according to this document, since it was trying to take place, as to Cyril Glass had mentioned, to curry to the Muslims at the time, there weren't any Ahmadiyyans around that period. But instead, you had people that were believing that Jesus was not put on the cross. He was not put on the physical cross. That someone else took the place. And the Gospel of Barnabas presents this view, as even from the words of Ahmad himself, that it is written that he was not put on the cross, nor did he die thereupon, which again reads almost quite parallel to what is read in sort of 4:157. But I digress from that point. That this is the information that the supposed prophet is supposed to be relaying to us. Another thing to point out. So he mentioned, okay, did he act? So if he did go through with the quote you mentioned in the Tariqa, which is parallel to what I quoted earlier about him living 80, did he live to be 80 years old? Because I thought it was 73. Did he live to be the age of 80 when he saw the second Khalifa? If you can, I would like some documentation that shows this, because all the sources, including the Ahmadiyyan sources. Sorry about that. I had some communication there. That all the sources, including the Ahmadiyyan sources, affirm that he died at the age of 73, if you add the dates of when he passed away and when he was born. Furthermore, to comment, show me in the context of when he's talking on a majority of the Jesus statements that he's attacking the Bible version of Jesus. I can see in what aspect, if when you're talking about when he's starting to attack Jesus and claiming that he plagiarized from the Talmud, that it mentions this is the essence of the Bible, but the context is there. But there are other volumes in which he goes after Jesus, such as volume chapter 9, where he says that he was not a pious worshiper, that he was a self-conceited claimant of deity, and he was an alcoholic and gluttonous person. He basically said, what was the character of Messiah according to you? An alcoholic and gluttonous person. He gives his own response. We ask, what is the character of the Messiah? When the Messiah is a figure that's in the Quran as well, according to you. So where in volume 9, page 387, is he speaking in context of the Bible? Because it's just simply saying, what is the character of the Messiah? Which Muslims affirm a Messiah and affirm it's Jesus. And here's what he's saying about him. So, that being said, so yeah, I mean, if what he says about Jesus, especially concerning, and that if he is serious as what he said about Abdullah Athim, he's also serious in what he is saying about Jesus in multiple instances of his writings. Now, concerning again the issues about the Gospels, they don't have to be written by Jesus to be affirming the Gospel according to Jesus, because his apostles were students who received the oral transmission, just in the same way that rabbis were able to then relay something to their students that they would pass on, just like in philosophers like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all these were going through passing out their deal. The same thing was done with a rabbi and a student situation. So we can trust what they say are the words of Jesus when they quote him, because they had that kind of knowledge, especially for people like Matthew, being a foreign tax collector, that he's relaying a good bit of this information that we can receive and trust that these are the words of Jesus. And the same thing with Mark, and the fact that he's getting his tradition from Peter, for the writing. So we have two sources that can authenticate what Jesus is saying, and that the Gospels of at least Matthew and Mark, if you want to just go there, affirm what Jesus actually says reliably from oral transmission. All right. I'm ending my time there, and we're going to take it to the 15-minute cross-examination, which means for 15 minutes, Ahmadi Muslim has a chance to ask me several questions for his time period. I'll for this time, since I will be open and have to for this case, I will be answer. I'll remind him of how much time he has left verbally. So whenever you're ready, feel free to ask me the first question, and I'll start your time.
So my question is that, well, these sources you get, are translated by anti-Ahmadi websites, and these sources where you get these things are from a site known as Idara Dawat Urshid, the well-known Ahmadi website. So, what I want to ask is that why rely on these websites when you can go straight to the Ahmadi, or at least like come to like Coffee Cake in True Islam at your closest Ahmadi mosque, or even talk with one of our imams about these things, who have enough of the Urdu of these things.
Right. So is that your question?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure you got to ask it in full. The reason why is because there's no Ahmadiyans in our community. We have a couple of Nation of Islams, and as what we've discovered recently, an Assemblies of God church has sold its mosque to, or sold its church to a mosque that's going to be built. And from what we've gathered, they are Orthodox Sunnis. So we don't have any Ahmadiyans within the community where I live. So I can't do that. Secondly, I've tried going online to see about these sources, but all we have are the Urdu and the Arabic copies of this particular work. There is not an English translated passage of it. And with the anti-Islamic site that you had mentioned, some of which I did get the translation from there, amongst other websites, that these are the ones that are actually taking the time to learn the language and to translate and go through some of these statements that are mentioned in these passages. Even other sheikhs in the mosques have gathered to refute these certain things that Mirza Gulam Ahmad had said. If there is a better translation that you can provide for what is written in these books, I will then gladly accept it if I can, test what is actually being said there. And plus, since they have had these books for years and they have these volumes, why not take the time to, for the sake of especially the English-speaking world, translate it into English so that we could understand it, but instead they keep it untranslated in these several volumes that they have. So I have to rely on some English translation.
Okay. The second question that I have is that why do you say that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad knew that Jesus was God, and that he had great fear of him, from what I understand from what you're saying on your point?
Well, I'm going by what he had said. I don't think he said that Jesus knew he was God, but I basically say that he thinks that Jesus thought of himself as God, because he says specifically, what was the character of Messiah according to you? An alcoholic and gluttonous person, neither abstinent nor a pious worshiper, nor an adorer of truth. He was an arrogant and self-conceited claimant of deity. When he uses the term of self-conceited claimant of deity, as well as arrogant being before that, he's seeming to imply that he's not, but that he's delusional or something along those lines. So I don't think that he thought that Jesus knew with absolute knowledge. He just assumed that he was, or something along those lines. And I think that's made clearly in why he's writing that. And that's why I asked if you were able to provide a context, because you said that all these statements were about the Bible version. I don't see where he says Bible in this context versus a couple of them.
The reason why I say that he's criticizing the biblical Jesus is based on, from what I read in Jesus in India and some of his other works, such as I believe Barahin, Ahmadiyya, and The Essence of Islam, which is technically not a work of Mirza, but it's just a collection of various references that he has that he said over the years, compiled into one volume, several volumes.
Mhm. Okay.
And further, I don't know if I can answer like in since we're in a different part of the conversation. I don't know if I can. What was it? Oh, right. Uh, like, could I answer like when you wanted the context of what Jesus said in Spiritual Treasures regarding like everything he said in thesis?
I mean, I can ask that whenever it's my time, but right now you have because I'm not going to be able to ask any questions right now. It's you still have 8 minutes and 50 seconds to ask me the questions you got.
I was stopped at 12:22. Um. Okay, so where do you get the information of like Mark getting his stuff from Peter? Like where exactly in the New Testament does it say that Mark got his stuff from Peter?
Mhm.
Perhaps.
It doesn't say from the New Testament that Mark got his information from Peter, but based on what I believe is in the Book of Acts, as well as the attestation of church fathers, that's for sure is that those who the four church fathers that attest to the authorship of the Gospels mentioned that Mark was dictated to Peter as a scribe. So he was a well-educated, knowledgeable person. He was a Gentile, but he was dictated to Peter to be a scribe to write down for Peter. This is one of the things that scribes had constantly. I think Paul could have written some of his works, but he definitely dictated a good bit of his letters to scribes. And in fact, if you look at some of the epistles that Paul has written, it even addresses somewhere towards the ending who is the scribe name that is writing for Paul, but also still mentions Paul in the letter at the same time in the introduction. This is just how the ancient world wrote their books. So it's based on, I believe, somewhere in Acts. I'll have to check to verify where it mentions that Mark is then given to Peter as a scribe, as well as the early church fathers, who some of them met the apostles themselves and were even students of the apostles.
Now another question is,
Mhm.
since you mentioned that Ibn Abbas is one of the is one of the greatest scholars in Islam because Muhammad blessed him with divine knowledge through his prayers to Allah. My question is, why believe this since you don't believe in Allah or even Islam?
Say again.
Uh, my question is, why say that according to a narration that Ibn Abbas was blessed because he was a great scholar, but yet you do not believe in Allah or
Mhm.
Islam, and that, or nor do you believe that Allah is the true God?
Mhm. Well, the reason I bring it up is because this is what the Muslims should believe. This is from the Muslim sources. And if you're going to be a consistent Muslim, you have to accept the Muslim sources. And that is that it comes from a Sahih authentic hadith that has been written down in Sunan Ibn Majah. It's been classified as Sahih, where it says that Allah teach him wisdom and the correct interpretation of the book. This is was speaking down on Ibn Abbas. And then concerning the same thing that's mentioned in the Ibn Kathir commentary that's from Bukhari. So again, these are all authentic Muslim sources. I don't personally believe that he was blessed by Allah or that Muhammad received revelation or any of these things. But if you are a Muslim and you believe in the supernatural worldview that Islam provides, and that you believe that the Hadith and the Sunnah are important, especially in interpretation of the Quran, as well as the fact of tafsirs and scholars. I never said, by the way, Ibn Abbas was a scholar. I just simply said that they viewed him as a great interpreter of the Quran. I don't know too much about Ibn Abbas, if he was a scholar or not, but that he was just simply an interpreter, like Muhammad wasn't a scholar. But that if you're a Muslim, this is what you affirm. You affirm the Hadith. You affirm what the companions, as well as Muhammad, has said and what they believed about the Quran. So that's the reason why I bring that out, is that, okay, if that's the case, focus on what they say. So that way I'm going by the same standard that you would use for the Quran and the Hadith, and I'm applying that standard in the criticism. And when I would apply, and I wish the same thing to be done if critiquing the Bible, not to go to a outside secular source that just simply contradicts everything, like Bart Ehrman, for example, or John Dominic Crossan, but rather, if you want something that can show that what I'm doing can be consistent with Islam in the criticism, I'm going to what is found in Ibn Abbas and what they say about these issues. So that way I can show that I'm being consistent in my criticism of this particular religion. That's why I had quoted Ibn Abbas, is that he had said what he said about the words, where he said in Surah, what Ibn Kathir claims, that is commenting on Surah 3, Ayah 78, they alter and add, although none among Allah's creation can remove the words of Allah from his books. They alter and distort their meanings, which is the version of corruption that began at that point. The version where it says that they started textually corrupting the books, that interpretation doesn't come until a Muslim in Spain within the 11th century comes into place.
I got a couple minutes left, so my last question is, why do you reject the spoon theory? Because as we see in the Gospels on Mark chapter 15, verse 44, Pilate was pretty surprised that Jesus died so quickly compared with the two other people that are crucified right next to him. And then further, his wife, I believe in Matthew chapter 27, verse 19, had a dream, a very distressful dream, regarding Jesus, that if they keep him, crucified, then they're gonna be punished. And this is what Mirza Gulam Ahmad referenced in Jesus in India.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So concerning the issue, why do I reject the swoon theory? Because it's ahistorical. You have to answer several questions as to why. If it is true, for example, then how would we explain the wholesale belief by the early secular historians, such as Josephus and Tacitus, that he, in fact, did die? The fact that the professional centurion executioner told Pilate that Jesus was dead. And how could he have been mistaken with his professional experience, especially since the structure that... I'm going to need you to mute for a second. Getting some feedback. Hang on. All right. So concerning the issue, now that I can concentrate a bit, so yeah, the training for crucifixion was very extreme and conscious back then to make sure that people that died, like as you see, that they had to break the legs. The breaking of the legs would basically cut off the circulation of oxygen so that they would increase the death faster. And they saw that they didn't need to break Jesus' legs because they saw, well, he had already ceased. He's already passed away. They even stabbed him in the side, which then blood started coming out, as well as a bit of water, and that is a sign of death by asphyxiation. John chapter 19, verse 31 to 33 can be this kind of thing, which you see it's they're examining Jesus, the body of Jesus, and they said that the soldier examined and said that he is dead, and that they did not have to break his legs. And in fact, what was even crazier is that if you were under that time period as a guard in the execution spot, and they found out that the body at some point did survive, then you are going to be you're going to be executed by the Roman government for failing to kill the body.
My time is up.
So it's quite clear that no record records of this, neither in the Gospels or in the Book of Acts, that this was the case, that there was guards that were punished if this was a failure, because they would have known. Then you have the centurions at the end did not break Jesus' legs, like I said. So how could they have been mistaken? How could Jesus, after being up all night, being beaten repeatedly, nailed to the cross, kept with 75 pounds of burial spices tied in grave cloths, buried in the cold, damp tomb, how could he have revived with enough strength to roll away with the stone single-handedly, overcome with the Roman military guard? And why would Jesus, who consistently preached for us to tell the truth with an honest heart, assert that he had been risen from the dead, as we read in the Gospels, especially towards the end? We may reject Mark 16 verses 9 to 20, but Mark 16 in verses like in those few verses, in verses 1 to 8, we see that the angel says that he had been resurrected, as well as the fact that Jesus then explains of his own resurrection in the Matthew and in Luke and in John of his resurrection. If that's the case, why is he telling his disciples to do this, and why has this been the oral tradition for quite some time? So there's several historical problems that are wrong with this case. So yeah, with that, I would simply say that you know, if the swing theory is correct, then we must deny a lot of good history that we have today. So with that being said and done, I'm going to then start my 15-minute examination once I get my clock set up. Okay. I haven't got a chance to write down all my questions, so it's going to be a little impromptu, and we'll have to base off the trail. So the first question I have is, do you believe that Mirza Gulam Ahmad lived to be 80?
Well, according to the sources of Mirza Gulam Ahmad himself, he didn't really know that when he would die.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
He basically, in several sources, and then I will share some right now. I'm gonna scroll down right now. Wow. I can't find it. But in one source, he said that perhaps I may be 70 years old, which, but I don't know how old I am. So basically, just my belief, while it is according to the official the official birth date of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in 1835, based on calculations, no, he did not live to be exactly 80, but he did live like a few years before 80, because where he gets few from the Arabic word feed, it can mean like several years, just like how when we answer an allegation made by Christians against Surah, I believe 30, regarding the Romans being defeated. Feed can mean several things. So, and with that, you can go on to your next question.
Okay. So in volume 19 of Spiritual Treasures, he says that God has given him the good news that he should live for 80 years or more. He says that at that point that he wrote this, in volume 19 of Rani Kazani, you can take however young he could have been for that when he wrote that. did he live for? He says that God has told him the good news that he's gonna live for 80 years or more. I mean, do you think that either God was at fault there, or that because you mentioned in one case it says 70, but now 70 something. I agree. He didn't know when he was going to die, but here it says that God has given him the good news that he shall live for 80 years or more. So how do you interpret that?
Well, I would say that he lived close to 80, but because he didn't know how old he was, only God knows.
Mm-hmm. So wait, you're saying we don't know how old he died?
Yeah, he didn't know how old he died.
No,
So,
I'm saying, do we know how old we died? Did he died?
and that time, no, but
No, I'm saying today. Can we know for a fact how old he was whenever Mirza Ghulam Ahmad died?
oh, okay, okay. Yes, based on mathematical calculations, based on over several of his references over the years.
Right, and based also on the fact that in one work he also said that he had been revealed to God that he should live for 80 years at least, if not more. So, I mean, again, that's my question. There is that, do you think that that is him saying that God's revealed to him that he's going to live at least 80 more years in his life, or that at least be 80 years old?
Yeah, that's probably just a diversity of the revelations.
So he received
I
mixed
think it's
revelations.
I think it's just whatever the situation is in life where God decides to take him, because the revelations are of diverse kinds.
Isn't Allah all knowing though?
From what we understand from the revelations, either he's gonna die in his late 70s or early 80s.
But isn't Allah all knowing though?
Yes.
And isn't, according to the doctrine of Qadar, the doctrine of predestination, that things have been written down in the eternal tablets that would happen?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, if it's already determined when he's going to die, and what age and what time, then why is Allah having then to reveal different dates and different ages of times that he's supposedly supposed to die?
Personally, I don't know.
Okay, so you don't
Because
know.
it's kind of yeah, because it's kind of hard to tell.
Okay, so going to Muhammad Ali Khan, who was the guy who was the Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's son-in-law, and what he said about the Abdullah Hatim prophecy, that it was not fulfilled, that Abdullah Hatim was safe, he's not being flung into hell, and that he considers that any other interpretation of that to be, just ridiculous, and is also saying that this prophecy concerning him has given birth to the very masterpiece of distortion and interpretation of prophecies. What are your thoughts on his son-in-law's comments on the prophecy being fulfilled? Because this was a letter written to Mirza Ghulam Ahmad.
I think he misunderstood some of the points of the prophecies, because as
Okay.
we see this reference from another companion, which I mentioned earlier, when it was the last day of the time appointed for Adam's chastisement, the Prophet came to the upper floor of the Masjid Mubarak and called for my lady Abd Tariq and said, I have received revelation, Allah has taken note of his grief and so. I have been given to understand that his refers to Atham. This shows that he would not die within the appointed period.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the companion you mentioned was probably not there when he received that revelation, or maybe he found it very hard to understand uh, why all of a sudden he's got a revelation that's taken note of his griefs, because as we understand from this reference, is that on which is from the Tathir on page 327 through page 328,
Hmm.
he began to recognize some of the greatness of Islam and recognizing its prestige. So, because of
Hmm.
this, his prophesied death and being afflicted to the utmost degree, he was in a manner afflicted by his greater affliction, which is called death, was delayed for a short while.
Hmm.
So, perhaps he
Okay.
may have been offering his own, the companion may have been offering his own opinion because he just was frustrated that he
Okay.
couldn't understand what was going on.
All right. All right. So I already also got your response on how your interpretation is of him talking about the Jesus thing, but can you show me anywhere in the context where he's trying to address the Jesus figure that is mentioned in the Bible? Because some of these just don't mention it. Like, for example, we see in volume 11, he says, a most shameful thing is the Sermon on the Mount, which is the essence of the Bible. So we could see subcontext of Bible version Jesus is being mentioned. But then you have volume 9, what was the character of Messiah? It just mentions Messiahship. So are there any context that we can see from these that shows that, just besides assuming that because he mentions it in one place, that's how we assume that every single time he mentions Jesus, it is in reference to the biblical version?
Yeah. So, what I've been told from someone who understands these Urdu references is that he was basically answering allegations, several allegations raised against Muhammad, and that the Christians were accusing Muhammad of plagiarizing the Gospel and the Torah with the Quran and taking ideas from it. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad decided to turn the tables on the Christians and say, "Hey, your Jesus plagiarized from the Talmud," which I will admit that the Talmud was written after the Gospels were written, but his points were that he was trying to turn the tables on the Christians and say that they're wrong. Then further, when he was attacking the character of the biblical Jesus of him being with a prostitute or drinking alcohol, again, this is in reply to the allegations against Muhammad uh, that Muhammad was pedophile and a rapist, and that he was just no good. And then any other questions?
Yeah. So one of them is, hang on a second, make sure the get to as much questions as I can get here. Okay, so according to the Gospel of Barnabas, do you? So first of all, do you believe that if he is a prophet, that he would go around promoting books that contain falsehoods?
I didn't catch that.
Do you believe that as a prophet, Mirza Gulam Ahmad is able to go around spreading falsehoods about material?
Do I believe that he was bringing falsehoods?
That he is able to, that he's able to be permitted to do that?
Well, because there's no like divine revelation that spoke out against it, I'd say that uh, because he wasn't intentionally lying. He was just going by the knowledge of the traditions of Muslims at the time.
I'm well aware of that, but what I'm asking is that, I mean, even then he could be given something from God about the matter, but regardless of whether he did or not, do you believe that even in one point of his life, he's able to go around spreading or tell something that is false? I didn't say a lie, but is false.
So he was going around. So do I believe that as a prophet he could go around saying false stuff?
Right. So when he says and goes promoting the Gospel of Barnabas, which of course he says that it talks about Jesus not being put on the cross, that it's an ancient book of document, and we can view it as such and make use of it as a historical document. Even though it says it disagrees with his own interpretation of the crucifixion. You know, he's swoon theory. This says almost like substitution theory, and it also says that Muhammad was not a was also the Messiah. I mean, do you think that that's something that should be promoted by a prophet of someone who follows the Quran?
Well, personally, this is like my personal opinion. I would say like no, but because at the time that he didn't have like we didn't have like much knowledge of the Gospel of Barnabas at the time as compared to now. Um, can't really say that what he did was wrong because he just didn't know. And then as for being divinely permitted to do that, there's from what I know, there's not really any revelation where either he was permitted or not permitted. He was just going by tradition of Muslim scholars over the years.
I didn't say divinely permitted. I just simply said permitted as in allowed to without being corrected or chastised for that.
That wasn't intentionally. He wasn't chastised for that because he wasn't intentionally lying. He was just.
I know. I understand.
By tradition.
So the last question I got then, again, because this is really bothering me. I mean, I can understand how you then interpret the prophecy of Abdullah Hathim, but concerning the issue again about the age of when he passed away, when he, in his one book, he explicitly says in his writing that God's given him the good news that he should live for 80 years or more. You said in one case he was supposedly 70. We established that God is all-knowing, that there's the doctrine of Qadar in Islam, and that there is, and that if he's able to do that, he doesn't need to depend on having to have his mind changed. God knows exactly when it's going to happen. So if he did, two questions, I guess then. Did he die at the age of 80? And if not, why then does he get all these different age things? Like you said, he was told 70 and now, and the another one he's told 80.
Personally, I don't know, but this is pretty much a tendency in his revelations, as we see from other revelations, such as the ones regarding Ahmadi Begum and her father. That's her father would die within 3 years of the marriage, but because there's two different revelations regarding his chastisement, but because I believe they got married in 1891. But however, the father of Muhammadi Begum ended up dying a year later in accordance with several prophecies made back in 1886 and 1888 because of his continued campaign against Islam.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's our end of our Q&A. So you will now have about 5 minutes for your closing case and for your closing statements, and then I'll have 5 for mine, and that'll be the end of the debate. So whenever you're ready, feel free to close the debate with your closing statements.
So, in truth, I believe that Mirza Gulam Ahmad was a true prophet of God. He resembled Jesus greatly, in that he was a very humble man. He preached peace. He abolished jihad of the sword, and he preached love for all and hatred for none. Many of his prophecies, such as the ones that I've mentioned earlier, have come true. And that's what I said in the video. Like I said, is not technically my Jamaat's view. It's my own personal opinion from what I know of. So just in case if anyone misunderstands that my views are in accordance with that of Jamaat scholars, I just would like to clear up any misunderstanding on any parts of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, And personally, that's all I have to say, even though I still have 3 minutes left.
All right. So that's your closing statements?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start mine then. I would like to thank Ahmadi Muslim 1889 for showing up to the debate and participating. I would like to thank the audience for watching, as well as thanking the Lord Jesus Christ for giving us the grace and mercy to, as well as God himself for giving us the grace and mercy to be here. So I want to just say this, that I've laid out a case. It is up to you to decide, based upon the evidence that's laid out, whether or not that Mirza Gulam Ahmad is a true prophet. But I think the one thing that should be laid out is the way that he has attacked Jesus in some of the writings. Now, until one can prove that what he is saying is exactly focusing on a biblical perspective or not, what shows is that if we examine it, whether it is or not, the history shows the biblical concept of Jesus. That what we see about is written down over the years, that from historians, that Jesus was crucified, and then they all viewed him as God and worshipped him. And the fact is that the Gospels, which are a historical document, and we can rely on them as reliable textually, that they all affirm in all the manuscripts that we have that Jesus is indeed God, and that he claimed divinity, as Abdullah, or not as Abdullah, as Mirza Gulam Ahmad himself had noted in volume 9, page 387 of Spiritual Treasures, also known as Urani Kazani. So, and the fact is that with that Jesus being one of the, also considered a prophet of Islam, but in his prophethood as in Christianity, he was also God, and being so, was able to forgive sins, and on the cross, he shed his blood on the cross for our sins, so that in him we could be forgiven and redeemed. Not because of any good deeds, not because of sticking to a tradition, rather it be within the law, or as in later on we see in Islam or Ahmadiyya. But rather it's by faith alone that we are justified in Christ, and that in him we can find all the prophecies are fulfilled from the Old Testament, and that his apostles that he chose and that came around preaching truth that was established historically and managed to survive and be strong for the remainder of its years. The Quran spreads the lies and falsehoods about him, and that and the Ahmadis, and especially Mirza Gulam Ahmad himself, continued to spread these lies about who Jesus is. So that's the one main definite essential, in fact, that shows of him not being a true prophet, especially attacking, even in Islamic theology, one of the prophets of God. And even more than that, that he was merely more than just a simple prophet, more than a simple Nabi, more than a mere Rasul, but rather that he was also the divine Son of God, and that he has laid his life down on the cross, so that whoever calls upon the name of the Lord, whoever believes in him, shall be saved. So it is easy as that. And because of that, and the fact that Mirza Gulam Ahmad has denied this and has attacked this, it shows, along with the other cases that I've laid out, that Mirza Gulam Ahmad is indeed a false prophet that does not follow with the standards of God, rather it be from the Torah, the Injil, or the Quran, or the Hadith, whichever one you want to take in testing the standards, because as the Bible even says, to test all things, to even test the prophets. Don't just accept what they say, examine them within the scriptures, and especially for a Christian, examining it from the light of the perspective of the Gospels and the Torah. Mirza Gulam Ahmad has failed the test in testing with what has happened in his life, and what should affirm within the theology that he is supposed to be affirming and holding up to, and that he has failed this test. So, with that being said, I would just say if there's anyone that is in doubt about this, just examine the evidence itself. Examine what we have both laid out, and make your case. And I guarantee you, you will not make the wrong mistake. With that being said, I will end my time on my closing statements. I would like to thank, again, Ahmadi Muslim for showing up and having the debate with me. And I would like to thank y'all for tuning in.